Hey everyone, it's Karina back for this week's reading from Jean Craighead George's My Side of the Mountain. We're starting on page 112. The chapter is titled, In Which I Pile Up Wood and Go On with Winter. Now I am almost to that snowstorm. The morning after, I had the awful thought about the wood. I got up early. I was glad to hear the nuthatches and chickadees. They gave me the feeling that I still had time to chop. They were bright, busy, and totally unworried about storms. I shouldered my axe and went out. I had used most of the wood around the Hemlock House, so I crossed to the top of the gorge. First I took all the dry limbs off the trees and hauled them home. Then I chopped down dead trees. With wood all around me, I got in my tree and put my arm out. I made an X in the needles. Where the X lay, I began stacking wood. I wanted to be able to reach my wood from the tree when the snow was deep. I piled a big stack at this point. I reached out the other side of the door and made another X. I piled wood here. Then I stepped around my piles and had a fine idea. I decided that if I used up one pile, I could tunnel through the snow to the next and the next. I made many wood piles leading out into the forest. I watched the sky. It was as blue as summer, but ice was building up along the waterfall at the gorge. I knew winter was coming, although each day the sun would rise in a bright sky and the days would follow cloudless. I piled more wood. This is when I realized that I was scared. I kept cutting wood and pulling it like a nervous child biting his nails. It was almost with relief that I saw the storm arrive. Now I am back where I began. I won't tell it again. I shall go on now with my relief and the fun and wonderfulness of living on a mountaintop in the winter. The bear and weasel loved the snow and was up and about in it every day before Frightful and I had our breakfast. Professor Bando's jam was my standby in those cold mornings. I would eat mounds of it on my hard acorn pancakes, which I improved by adding hickory nuts. With these as a bracer for the day, Frightful and I would stamp out into the snow and reel down the mountain. She would fly above my head as I slid and plunged and rolled to the creek. The creek was frozen. I would slide out into it, break a little hole, and ice fish. The sun would glance off the white snow, the birds would fly through the trees, and I would come home with a fresh meal from the valley. I found there were still plants under the snow, and I would dig down and get teaberry leaves and wintergreen. I got this idea from the deer, who found a lot to eat under the snow. I tried some of the mosses that they liked, but decided moss was for deer. Around 4 o'clock, we would all wander home, the nuthatches, the chickadees, the cardinals, Frightful, and me. And now came the nicest part of wonderful days. I would stop in the meadow and throw Frightful off my fist. She would wind into the sky and wait above me as I kicked the snow-bent grasses. A rabbit would pop up, or sometimes a pheasant. Out of the sky, from a pinpoint of a thing, would dive my beautiful falcon. And oh, she was beautiful when she made a strike, all power and beauty. On the ground, she would cover her quarry. Her perfect feathers would stand up on her body and her wings would arch over the food. She never touched it until I came and picked her up. I would go home and feed her, then crawl into my tree room, light a little fire on my hearth, and Frightful and I would begin the winter evening. I had lots of time to cook and try mixing different plants with different meats to make things taste better. And I must say, I originated some excellent meals. When dinner was done, the fire would blaze on. Frightful would sit on the foot of the post of the bed and preen and wipe her beak and shake. Just the fact that she was alive was a warming thing to know. I would look at her and wonder what made a bird and a boy a boy. The forest would become silent. I would know that the bear and weasel was about, but I would not hear him. Then I would get a piece of birch bark and write. Or I would make new things out of deer hide, like a hood for Frightful. And finally, I would take off my suit and my moccasins and crawl into my bed under the sweet-smelling deerskin. The fire would burn itself out, and I would be asleep. Those were nights of the very best sort. One night, I read some of my old notes about how to pile wood so I could get to it under the snow, and I laughed until Frightful awoke. I hadn't made a single tunnel. I walked out on the snow to get wood like Baron Weasel went for food or the deer went for moss. The next chapter, in which I learn about birds and people. Frightful and I sat down to living in snow. We went to bed early, slept late, ate the mountain harvest, and explored the country alone. Oh, the deer walked with us, the foxes followed in our footsteps, the winter birds flew over our heads, but mostly we were alone in the white wilderness. It was nice. It was very, very nice. My deerskin rabbit-lined suit was so warm that even when my breath froze in my nostrils, my body was snug and comfortable. Frightful fluffed on the coldest days, but a good flight into the air around the mountain would warm her, and she would come back to my fist with a thump and a flip. This was her signal of good spirits. I did not become lonely. Many times during the summer I thought of the long winter months ahead with some fear. I had read so much about the loneliness of the farmer, the trapper, the woodsman during the bleakness of winter that I had come to believe it. The winter was as exciting as the summer, maybe more so. The birds were magnificent and almost tame. They talked to each other, warned each other, fought for food, for kingship, and for the right to make the most noise. Sometimes I would sit in my doorway, which became an entrance to behold, a portico of pure white snow adorned with snowmen, and watch them with endless interest. They reminded me of 3rd Avenue, and I gave them the names that seemed to fit. There was Mr. Brackett. He lived on the 1st floor of our apartment house, and no one could sit on his step or even make a noise near his door without being chased. Mr. Brackett, the chickadee, spent most of his time chasing young chickadees through the woods. Only his mate could share his favorite perches and feeding places. Then there were Mrs. O'Brien, Mrs. Calloway, and Mrs. Frederio. On 3rd Avenue, they would all go off to the market together first thing in the morning, talking and pushing and stopping to lecture children in the gutters and streets. Mrs. Frederio always followed Mrs. O'Brien, and Mrs. O'Brien always followed Mrs. Calloway in talking and pushing and even in buying an apple. And there they were again in my hemlock, 3 busy chickadees. They would flit and rush about and click and fly from one eating spot to another. They were noisy, scolding, and busily following each other. All the other chickadees followed them, and they made way only for Mr. Brackett. The chickadees, like the people on 3rd Avenue, had their favorite routes to and from the best food supplies. They each had their own resting perches, and each had a little shelter in a tree cavity to which they would fly when the day was over. They would chatter and call good night and make a big fuss before they parted. And then the forest would be as quiet as the apartment house on 3rd Avenue when all the kids were off the streets and all the parents had said their last words to each other and everyone had gone to their own little hole. Sometimes when the wind howled and the snows blew, the chickadees would be out for only a few hours. Even Mr. Brackett, who had been elected by the chickadees to test whether or not it was too stormy for good hunting, would appear for a few hours and disappear. Sometimes I would find him just sitting quietly on a limb next to the hole of a tree, all fluffed up and doing nothing. There was no one who more enjoyed doing nothing on a bad day than Mr. Brackett of 3rd Avenue. Frightful, the 2 Mr. Bracketts and I shared this feeling. When the ice and sleet and snow drove down through the hemlocks, we all holed up. I looked at my calendar pole one day and realized that it was almost Christmas. Bando will come, I thought. I'll have to prepare a feast and make a present for him. I took stock of the frozen venison and decided that there were enough steaks for us to eat nothing but venison for a month. I scooped under the snow for tea-berry plants to boil down and pour over snowballs for dessert. I checked my cache of wild onions to see if I had enough to make onion soup and set aside some large, firm groundnuts for mashed potatoes. There were still piles of dogtooth violet bulbs and Solomon's seal roots and a few dried apples. I cracked walnuts, hickory nuts, and beech nuts, then began a pair of deerskin moccasins to be lined with rabbit fur for Bando's present. I finished these before Christmas, so I started a hat of the same materials. 2 days before Christmas, I began to wonder if Bando would come. Had he forgotten? I was sure. Or he was busy, I thought. Or maybe he thought that I was no longer here and decided not to tramp out through the snows to find out. On Christmas Eve, Bando still had not arrived, and I began to plan for a very small Christmas with Frightful. About 4:30 Christmas Eve, I hung a small red cluster of tea berries on the deerskin door. I went in my tea room for a snack of beech nuts when I heard a faint halloo from far down the mountain. I snuffed out my tallow candle, jumped into my coat and moccasins, and plunged out into the snow. Again, a halloo floated over the quiet snow. I took a bearing on the sound and bounced down the hill to meet Bando. I ran into him just as he turned up the valley to follow the stream bed. I was so glad to see him that I hugged him and pounded him on the back. "Never thought I'd make it," he said. "I walked all the way from the entrance of the state park. Pretty good, eh?" He smiled and slapped his tired legs. Then he grabbed my arm and with 3 quick pinches tested the meat on me. "You've been living quite well," he said. He looked closely at my face. "But you're gonna need a shave in a year or 2. I thanked him, and we sprang up the mountains, cut across through the gorge, and home. "How's the Frightful?" he asked as soon as we were inside and the light was lit. I whistled. She jumped to my fist. He got bold and stroked her. "And the jam?" he asked. "Excellent, except the crocks are absorbent and are sopping up all the juice." "Well, I brought you more sugar. We'll try next year." "Merry Christmas, Thoreau," he shouted and looked about the room. "I see you've been busy. A blanket, new clothes, and an ingenious fireplace with a real chimney. And say, you have silverware." He picked up the forks I had carved. We ate smoked fish for dinner with boiled dogtooth violet bulbs. Walnuts dipped in jam were dessert. Bando was pleased with his jam. When we were done, Bando stretched out on my bed. He propped his feet up and lit his pipe. "And now I have something to show you," he said. He reached in his coat pocket and took out a newspaper clipping. It was from a New York paper, and it read, "Wild boy suspected living off deer and nuts in wilderness of Catskills." I looked at Bando, leaned over to read the headline myself. "Have you been talking?" I asked. "Me? Don't be ridiculous. You have had several visitors other than me." "The fire warden, the old lady," I cried out. "Now, Thoreau, this could only be a rumor. Just because it is in print doesn't mean it's true. Before you get excited, sit still and listen." He read, "Residents of Delhi in the Catskill Mountains report that a wild boy who lives off deer and nuts is hiding out in the mountains. Several hunters stated that this boy stole deer from them during hunting season." "I did not," I shouted. "I only took the ones that they wounded and couldn't find." "Well, that's what they told their wives when they came home without their deer. Anyway, listen to this. This wild boy has been seen from time to time by Catskill residents, some of whom believe he is crazy." "Well, that's just a terrible thing to say." "Just awful," he said. "Any normal red-blooded American boy wants to live in a treehouse and trap his own food. They just don't do it, that's all." "Read on," I said. "Officials say there is no evidence of any boy living alone in the mountains, and add that all abandoned houses and sheds are routinely checked for just such events. Nevertheless, the residents assure that such a boy exists." End of story. "That's a lot of nonsense." I leaned back against the bedstead and smiled. "Oh, don't think that ends it," Bando said. and reached in his pocket for another clipping. This one is dated December 5th. The other was November 23rd. Shall I read? Yes. Old woman reports meeting wild boy while picking strawberries in Catskills. Mrs. Thomas Fiedler, 97, resident of Delhi, New York, told this reporter that she'd met a wild boy on Bitter Mountain just last June while gathering her annual strawberry jelly supply. She said the boy was brown-haired, dusty, and wandering aimlessly around the mountains. However, she added, he seemed to be in good flesh and happy. The old woman, a resident of the mountain resort town for 97 years, called this office to report her observation. Local residents report that Mrs. Fiedler is a fine old member of the community who occasionally sees imaginary things. Bando roared. I must say, I was sweating, for I really did not expect this turn of events. And now, went on Bando, and now the queen of the New York papers, this story is buried on page 19. No sensationalism for this paper. Headline: Boy reported living off land in Catskills. A young boy of 17 or 18 who left home with a group of Boy Scouts is reported to be still scouting in the area, according to the fire warden of the Catskill Mountains. Evidence of someone living in the forest, a fireplace, soup bones, and crack nuts, was reported by Warden Jim Handy, who spent the night in the wilderness looking for the lad. Jim stated that the young man had apparently left the area, as there was no evidence of his camp upon a second trip. What second trip? I asked. Bando puffed his pipe, looked at me wistfully, and said, Are you ready to listen? Sure, I answered. Well, here's the rest of it. There was no trace of his camp on a second trip, and the warden believes that the young man returned to his home at the end of the summer. You know, Thoreau, I could scarcely drag myself away from the newspapers to come up here. You make a marvelous story. I said, Put more wood on the fire. It is Christmas. No one will be searching these mountains until May Day. Bando asked for the willow whistles. I got them for him, and after running the scale several times, he said, Let us serenade the ingenuity of the American newspaper man. Then let us serenade the conservationists who have protected the American wilderness, so that a boy can still be alone in this world of millions of people. I thought that was suitable, and we played Holy Night. We tried the 12 Days of Christmas, but the whistles were too stiff and Bando too tired. Thoreau, my body needs rest. Let's give up, he said. After 2 bad starts, I banked the fire and blew out the candle and slept in my clothes. It was Christmas when we awoke. Breakfast was light, acorn pancakes, jam, and sassafras tea. Bando went for a walk. I lit the fire in the fireplace and spent the morning creating a feast from the wilderness. I gave Bando his presents when he returned. He liked them. He was really pleased. I could tell by his eyebrows. They went up and down and in and out. Furthermore, I know he liked the presents because he wore them. The onion soup was about to be served when I heard a voice shouting in the distance. I know you're there. I know you're there. Where are you? Dad! I screamed and dove right through the door onto my stomach. I all but fell down the mountain shouting, Dad! Dad, where are you? I found him resting in a snowdrift, looking at the cardinal pair that lived near the stream. He was smiling, stretched out on his back, not in exhaustion, but in joy. Merry Christmas, he whooped. I ran toward him. He jumped to his feet, tackled me, thumped my chest, and rubbed snow in my face. Then he stood up, lifted me from the snow by the pockets of my coat, and held me off the ground so that we were eye to eye. He sure smiled. He threw me down in the snow again and wrestled with me for a few minutes. Our formal greeting done, we strode up the mountain. Well, son, he began, I've been reading about you in the papers, and I could no longer resist the temptation to visit you. I still can't believe you did it. His arm went around me. He looked real good, and I was overjoyed to see him. How did you find me? I asked. I went to Mrs. Fiedler, and she told me which mountain. At the stream I found your raft and ice fishing poles. Then I looked for trails and footsteps. When I thought I was getting warm, I hollered. Am I that easy to find? You didn't have to answer, and I'd probably have frozen in the snow. He was pleased and not angry at me at all. He said again, I just didn't think you'd do it. I was sure you'd be back the next day. When you weren't, I bet on the next week, then the next month. How is it going? Oh, it's a wonderful life, Dad. When we walked into the tree, Bando was putting the final touches on the venison steak. Dad, this is my friend, Professor Bando. He's a teacher. He got lost one day last summer and stumbled onto my camp. He liked it so well that he came back for Christmas. Bando, meet my father. Bando turned the steak on the spit, rose, and shook my father's hand. I am pleased to meet the man who sired this boy, he said grandly. I could see that they liked each other and that it was going to be a splendid Christmas. Dad stretched out on the bed and looked around. I thought maybe you'd pick a cave, he said. The papers reported that they were looking for you in old sheds and houses, but I knew better than that. However, I would never have thought of the inside of a tree. What a beauty. Very clever, son. Very, very clever. This is a comfortable bed. I noticed my food caches. He noticed my food caches, stood and peered into them. Got enough to last till spring? I think so, I said. If I don't keep getting hungry visitors all the time, I winked at him. Well, I would wear out my welcome by a year if I could, but I have to get back to work soon after Christmas. How's Mom and all the rest? I asked as I took down the turtle shell plates and set them on the floor. She's marvelous. How she manages to feed and clothe those 8 youngsters on what I bring her, I don't know. But she does it. She sends her love and says that she hopes you are eating well-balanced meals. The onion soup was simmering already. I gave Dad his. First course, I said. He breathed deeply of the odor and downed it boiling hot. Son, this is better onion soup than the chef at the Waldorf can make. Bando sipped his, and I put mine in the snow to cool. Your mother will stop worrying about your diet when she hears of this. Bando rinsed Dad's soup bowl in the snow, and with great ceremony and elegance, he could really be elegant when the occasion arose, poured him a turtle shell of sassafras tea. Quoting a passage from one of Dickens's food-eating scenes, he carved the blackened steak. It was pink and juicy inside, cooked to perfection. We were all proud of it. Dad had to finish his tea before he could eat. I was short on bowls. Then I filled his shell. A mound of sort of fluffy mashed cattail tubers, mushrooms, and dogtooth violet bulbs smothered in gravy, thickened with acorn powder. Each plate had a pile of soaked and stewed honey locust beans mixed with hickory nuts. The beans are so hard it took 3 days to soak them. It was a glorious feast. Everyone was impressed, including me. When we were done, Bando went down to the stream and cut some old, dried and hollow reeds. He came back and carefully made us each a flute with the tip of his penknife. He said the willow whistles were too old for such an occasion. We all played Christmas carols until dark. Bando wanted to try some complicated jazz tunes, but the late hour, the small fire dancing and throwing heat, and the snow insulating us from the winds made us all so sleepy that we were not capable of more than a last slow rendition of taps before we put ourselves on and under skins and blew out the light. Before anyone was awake the next morning, I heard Frightful call hungrily. I had put her outside to sleep as we were very overcrowded. I went out to find her. Her Christmas dinner had been a big piece of venison, but the night air had enlarged her appetite. I called her to my fist, and we went into the meadows to rustle up breakfast for the guests. She was about to go after a rabbit, but I thought that wasn't proper fare for a post-Christmas breakfast, so we went to the stream. Frightful caught herself a pheasant while I kicked a hole in the ice and did a little ice fishing. I caught about 6 trout and whistled Frightful to my hand. We returned to the hemlock. Dad and Bando were still asleep, with their feet in each other's faces, but both looking very content. I built the fire and was cooking the fish and making pancakes when Dad shot out of bed. "Wild boy," he shouted. "What a sanguine smell! What a purposeful fire! Breakfast in a tree! Son, I toil from sun up to sundown, and I never have I ever lived so well. I served him. He choked a bit on the acorn pancake. They are a little flat and hard. But Bando got out some of his blueberry jam and smothered the pancakes with an enormous portion. Dad went through the motions of eating his. The fish, however, he enjoyed, and he asked for more. We drank sassafras tree, sweetened with some of the sugar Bando had brought me, rubbed our turtle shells clean in the snow, and went out into the forest. Dad had not met Frightful. When she winged down out of the hemlock, he ducked and flattened out in the snow, shouting, "Blast off!" He was very cool toward Frightful until he learned that she was the best provider we had ever had in our family, and then he continually praised her beauty and admired her talents. He even tried to pet her, but Frightful was not to be won. She snagged him with her talons. They stayed away from each other for the rest of Dad's visit, although Dad never ceased to admire her from a safe distance. Bando had to leave 2 or 3 days after Christmas. He had some papers to grade, and he started off reluctantly one morning, looking very unhappy about the way of life he had chosen. He shook hands all around and then turned to me and said, "I'll save all the newspaper clippings for you, and if the reporters start getting too hot on your trail, I'll call the New York papers and give them a bum steer." I could see he rather liked the idea and departed a little happier. Dad lingered on for a few more days, ice fishing, setting my traps and snares, and husking walnuts. He whittled some cooking spoons and forks. On New Year's Day, he announced that he must go. "I told your mother I would only stay for Christmas. It's a good thing she knows me, or she might be worried." "She won't send the police out to look for you?" I asked hurriedly. "Could she think you never found me?" "Oh, I told her I'd call her Christmas night if I didn't." He poked around for another hour or two, trying to decide just how to leave. Finally, he started down the mountain. He had hardly gone 100 feet before he was back. "I've decided to leave by another route. Somebody might backtrack me and find you, and that would be too bad." He came over to me and put his hand on my shoulder. "You've done very well, Sam." He grinned and walked off toward the gorge. I watched him bound from rock to rock. He waved from the top of a large rock and leapt into the air. That was the last I saw of Dad for a long time. Next chapter, in which I have a good look at winter and find spring in the snow. With Christmas over, the winter became serious. The snows deepened, the wind blew, the temperatures dropped until the air snapped and talked. Never had humanity seemed so far away as it did in those cold, still months of January, February, and March. I wandered the snowy crags, listening to the language of the birds by day and to the noises of the weather by night. The wind howled, the snow avalanched, and the air creaked. I slept, ate, played my reed whistle, and talked to Frightful. To be relaxed, warm, and part of the winter wilderness is an unforgettable experience. I was in excellent condition. Not a cold, not a sniffle, not a moment of fatigue. I enjoyed the feeling that I could eat, sleep, and be warm, and outwit the storms that blasted the mountains and the sub-zero temperatures that numbed them. It snowed on. I plowed through drifts and stamped paths until eventually it occurred to me that I had all the materials to make snowshoes for easier traveling. Here are the snowshoe notes. I made slats out of ash saplings, whittling them thin enough to bow. I soaked them in water to make them bend more easily, looped the two ends together, and wound them wide. With my penknife, I made holes an inch apart all around the loop. I strung deer hide crisscross through the loops. I made a loop of hide to hold my toe and straps to tie the shoes on. When I first walked in these shoes, I tripped on my toes and fell, but by the end of the first day, I could walk from the tree to the gorge in half the time. I live close to the weather. It is surprising how you watch it when you live in it. Not a cloud passed unnoticed, not a wind blew untested. I knew the moods of the storms, where they came from, their shapes and colors. When the sun shone, I took Frightful to the meadow, and we slid down the mountain on my snapping turtle shell sled. She really didn't care much for this. When the winds changed and the air smelled like snow, I would stay in my tree because I had gotten lost in a blizzard one afternoon and had to hole up in a rock ledge until I could see where I was going. That day the winds were so strong I could not push against them, so I crawled under the ledge. For hours I wondered if I would be able to dig out when the storm blew on. Fortunately, I only had to push through about a foot of snow. However, that taught me to stay home when the air said, snow. Not that I was afraid of being caught far from home in a storm, for I could find food and shelter and make a fire anywhere. But I had become as attached to my hemlock house as a brooding bird to her nest. Caught out in the storms and weather, I had an urgent desire to return to my tree, even as the barren weasel returned to his den and the deer to their copse. We all had our little patch in the wilderness. We all fought to return there. I usually came home at night with the nuthatch that roosted in a nearby sapling. I knew I was late if I tapped the tree and he came out. Sometimes, when the weather was icy and miserable, I would hear him high in the tree near the edge of the meadow, yanking and flicking his tail, and then I would see him wing to the bed early. I considered him a pretty good barometer, and if he went to his tree early, I went to mine early too. When you don't have a newspaper or radio to give you weather bulletins, watch the birds and animals. They can tell when a storm is coming. I called the nuthatch barometer, and when he holed up, I holed up, lit my light, and sat by my fire whittling or learning new tunes on my reed whistle. I was now really into the teeth of winter, and quite fascinated by its activity. There's no such thing as a still winter night. Not only are many animals running around in the creaking cold, but the trees cry out and limbs snap and fall, and the wind gets caught in a ravine and screams until it dies. One noisy night, I put this down. There is somebody in my bedroom. I can hear small exchanges of greetings and little feet moving up the wall. By the time I get to my light, all is quiet. The next day, I wrote this. There was something in my room last night. A small tunnel leads out from my door into the snow. It is a marvelous tunnel, neatly packed, and it goes from a dried fern to a clump of moss. Then it turns and disappears. I would say a mouse. Later that night, I wrote, I kept an ember glowing and got a light fast before the visitor could get to the door. It was a mouse, a perfect little white-footed deer mouse with enormous black eyes and tidy white feet. Caught in the act of intruding, he decided not to retreat, but came toward me a few steps. I handed him a nut meat. He took it in his fragile paws, stuffed it in his cheek, flipped, and went out his secret tunnel. No doubt the tunnel leads right over to my store tree, and this fellow is having a fat winter. There were no raccoons or skunks about in the snow, but the mice, the weasels, the mink, the foxes, the shrews, the cottontail rabbits were all busier than Coney Island in July. Their tracks were all over the mountain, and their activities ranged from catching each other to hauling various materials back to their dens and burrows for more insulation. By day the birds were a wing. They got up late after I did and would call to each other before hunting. I would stir up my fire and think about how much food it must take to keep one little bird alive in that fierce cold. They must eat and eat and eat, I thought. Once, however, I came upon a male cardinal sitting in a hawthorn bush. It was a miserable day, gray, damp, and somewhat around the 0 mark. The cardinal wasn't doing anything at all, just sitting on a twig, all fluffed up to keep himself warm. Now there's a wise bird, I said to myself. He is conserving his energy. None of this flying around looking for food and wasting effort. As I watched him, he shifted his feet twice, standing one and pulling the other up into his warm feathers. I had often wondered why birds' feet didn't freeze, and there was my answer. He even sat down on both of them and let his warm feathers cover them like socks. January 8. I took Frightful out today. We went over to the meadow to catch a rabbit for her. As we passed one of the hemlocks near the edge of the grove, she pulled her feathers to her body and looked alarmed. I tried to find out what had frightened her, but saw nothing. On the way back, we passed the same tree, and I noticed an owl pellet cast in the snow. I looked up. There were lots of limbs and darkness, but I could not see the owl. I walked around the tree. Frightful stared at one spot until I thought her head would swivel off. I looked, and there it was, looking like a broken limb. A great horned owl. I must say I was excited to have such a neighbor. I hit the tree with a stick and he flew off. Those great wings, they must have been 5 feet across. Beat with the wind, but there was no sound. The owl steered down the mountain through the tree limbs, and somewhere not far away he vanished in the needles and limbs. It is really very special to have a horned owl. I guess I feel this way because he is such a wilderness bird. He needs lots of forest and big trees, and so his presence means that the Gribbly farm is a beautiful place indeed. One week the weather gave a little to the sun, and snow melted and limbs dumped their loads and popped up into the air. I thought I'd try to make an igloo. I was cutting big blocks of snow and putting them in a circle. Frightful was dozing with her face in the sun, and the tree sparrows were raiding the hemlock cones. I worked and hummed and did not notice the gray sheet of cloud that was sneaking up the mountain from the northwest. It covered the sun suddenly. I realized the air was damp enough to wring. I could stay as warm as a bug if I didn't get wet, so I looked at the drab mess in the sky, whistled for Frightful, and started back to the tree. We holed up just as Barometer was yanking his way home, and it was none too soon. It drizzled, it misted, it sprinkled, and finally it froze. The deer-hide door grew stiff with ice as darkness came, and it rattled like a piece of tin when the wind hit it. I made a fire. The tree warmed, and I puttered around with a concoction I call possum sop. A meal of frozen possums stewed with lichens, snakeweed, and lousewort. It is a different sort of dish. Of course, what I really like about it are the names of all the plants with the name possum. I fooled for an hour or so brewing this dish, adding this and that, when I heard the mouse in his tunnel. I realized he was making an awful fuss and decided it was because he was trying to gnaw through ice to get in. I decided to help him. Frightful was on her post, and I wanted to see the mouse's face when he found he was in the den with a falcon. I pushed the deerskin door. It wouldn't budge. I kicked it. It gave a little, cracking like china, and I realized that I was going to be iced up if I didn't keep the door open. I finally got it open. There must have been 1.5 inches of ice on it. The mouse, needless to say, was gone. I ate my supper and reminded myself to awaken and open the door off and on during the night. I put more wood on the fire, as it was damp in spite of the flames, and went to bed in my underwear and suit. I awoke twice and kicked the door open. Then I fell into a sound sleep that lasted hours beyond my usual rising time. I overslept, I discovered, because I was in a block of ice and none of the morning sounds of the forest penetrated my glass house to awaken me. First thing I did was try to open the door. I chipped and kicked and managed to get my head out to see what had happened. I was sealed in. Now, I've seen ice storms, and I know they can be shiny and glassy and treacherous, but this was something else. There were sheets of ice binding the aspens to earth and cementing tops of hemlocks in arches. It was inches thick. Frightful winged out of the door and flew to a limb where she tried to perch. She slipped, dropped to the ground, and skidded on her wings and undercoverts to a low spot where she finally stopped. She tried to get to her feet, slipped, lost her balance, and spread her wings. She finally flapped into the air and hovered there until she could locate a decent perch. She found one close against the hole of the hemlock. It was ice-free. I laughed at her, and then I came out and took a step. I landed with an explosion on my seat. The jolt splintered the ice and sent glass-covered limbs clattering to the earth like a shot full of shattering crystal. As I sat there, and I didn't dare to move because I might get hurt, I heard an enormous explosion. It was followed by splintering and clattering and smashing. A maple at the edge of the meadow had literally blown up. I feared now for my tree. The ice was too heavy to bear. While down, I chipped the deer flap clean and sort of swam back into my tree, listening to trees exploding all over the mountain. It was a fearful and dreadful sound. I lit a fire, ate smoked fish and dried apples, and went out again. I must say, I toyed with the idea of making ice skates. However, I saw the iron wagon axle iced against a tree and crawled to it. I de-iced it with the butt of my axe and used it for a cane. I would stab it into the ground an inch along. I fell a couple of times, but not as hard as that first time. Frightful saw me start off through the woods, for I had to see this winter display, and she winged to my shoulder, glad for a good perch. At the meadow, I looked hopefully for the sun, but it didn't have a chance. The sky was as thick as Indiana bean soup. Out in the open, I watched one tree after another splinter and break under the ice, and the glass sparks that shot into the air, and the thunder that the ice made as it shattered were something to remember. At noon, not a drip had fallen. The ice was as tight as it had been at dawn. I heard no nuthatches. The chickadees called once, but were silent again. There was an explosion near my spring. A hemlock had gone. Frightful and I crept back to the tree. I decided that if my house was going to shatter, I would just as soon be in it. Inside, I threw sticks to Frightful, and she caught them in her talons. This is a game we play when we are tense and bored. Night came, and the ice still lay in the sheets. We slept to the occasional boom of breaking trees, although the explosions were not as frequent. Apparently the most rotted and oldest trees had collapsed first. The rest were more resilient, and unless a wind came up, I figured the damage was over. At midnight, a wind came up. It awakened me, for the screech of the iced limbs rubbing each other and the snapping of the ice were like the sounds from a madhouse. I listened, decided there was nothing I could do, buried my head under the deer hide, and went back to sleep. Around 6 or 7, I heard Barometer, the nuthatch. He yanked as he went food hunting through the hemlock grove. I jumped up and looked out. The sun had come through, and the forest sparkled and shone in cruel splendor. That day, I heard the drip, drip begin, and by evening some of the trees had dumped their loads and were slowly lifting themselves to their feet, so to speak. The aspens and birch trees, however, were still bent like Indian bows. 3 days later, the forest arose. The ice melted, and for about a day or so, we had warm, glorious weather. The mountain was a mess. Broken trees, fallen limbs were everywhere. I felt badly about the ruins until I thought that this had been happening to the mountain for thousands of years, and the trees were still there, as were the animals and birds. The birds were starved, and many had died. I found their cold little bodies under bushes, and one stiff chickadee in a cavity. Its foot was drawn into its feathers. Its feathers were fluffed. Frightful ate old frozen muskrat during those days. We couldn't pick up a rabbit or even a mouse. They were in the snow under the ice, waiting it out. I suppose the mice went right on tunneling to the grasses and the mosses and had no trouble staying alive. But I did wonder how the Baron Weasel was doing. I needn't have. Here were some notes on him. I should not have worried about the Baron Weasel. He appeared after the ice storm, looking sleek and pleased with himself. I think he dined royally on the many dying animals and birds. In any event, he was full of pep and ran up the hemlock to chase Frightful off her perch. That Baron, it's a good thing I don't have to tie Frightful much anymore, or he would certainly try to kill her. He still attacks me, more for the fun of being sent sprawling out into the snow than for food, for he hasn't put his teeth in my trousers for months. January was a fierce month. After the ice storm came more snow. The mountain top was never free of it. The gorge was blocked. Only on the warmest days could I hear, deep under the ice, the trickle of water seeping over the falls. I still had food, and it was getting low. All the fresh frozen venison was gone, and most of the bulbs and tubers. I longed for just a simple dandelion green. Toward the end of January, I began to feel tired, and my elbows and knees were a little stiff. This worried me. I figured out it was due to some vitamin I wasn't getting, but I couldn't remember which vitamin it was or even where I would find it if I could remember it. One morning, my nose bled. It frightened me a bit, and I wondered if I shouldn't hike to the library and reread the material on vitamins. It didn't last long, however, so I figured it wasn't too serious. I decided I would live until the greens came to the land, for I was of the opinion that since I had nothing green for months, that was probably the trouble. On that same day, Frightful caught a rabbit in the meadow. As I cleaned it, the liver suddenly looked so tempting that I could hardly wait to prepare it. For the next week, I carved liver and ate all I could get. The tiredness ended, the bones stopped aching, and I had no more nosebleeds. Hunger is a funny thing. It has a kind of intelligence all its own. I ate liver almost every day until the first plants emerged, and I never had any more trouble. I have looked up vitamins since. I'm not surprised to find that if liver is rich in vitamin C, so are citrus fruits and green vegetables, the foods I lacked. Wild plants like sorrel and dock are rich in this vitamin. Even if I had known this at that time, it would have done me no good, for they were but roots in the earth, as it turned out. Liver was the only available source of vitamin C, and on liver I stuffed without knowing why. So much for my health. I wondered now why I didn't have more trouble than I did, except that my mother worked in a children's hospital during the war, helping to prepare food, and she was conscious of what made up a balanced meal. We heard a lot about it as kids, so I was not unaware that my winter diet was off balance. After that experience, I noticed things in the forest that I hadn't paid any attention to before. A squirrel had stripped the bark off a sapling at the foot of the meadow, leaving it gleaming white. I pondered when I saw it, wondering if he had lacked a vitamin or two and had sought them in the bark. I must admit, I tried a little of the bark myself, but decided that even if it was loaded with vitamins, I preferred liver. I also noticed that the birds would sit in the sun when it favored our mountain with its light, and I, being awfully vitamin-minded at the time, wondered if they were gathering vitamin D. To be on the safe side in the view of this, I sat in the sun too when it was out. So did Frightful. My notes piled up during these months, and my journal of birch bark became a storage problem. I finally took it out of my tree and cached it under a rock ledge nearby. The mice made nests in it, but it held up even when it got wet. That's one thing about using the products of the forest. They are usually weatherproof. This is important when the weather is as near to you as your skin and is as much a part of your life as eating. I was writing more about animals now and less about myself, which proves I was feeling pretty safe. Here's an interesting entry. February 6. The deer have pressed in all around me. They're hungry. Apparently they stamp out yards in the valleys where they feed during the dawn and dusk, but many of them climb back to the hemlock grove to hide and sleep for the day. They manage the deep snows so effortlessly on those slender hooves. If I were to know that 1,000,000 years from today my children's children's children were to live as I am living in these mountains, I should marry me a wife with slender feet and begin immediately to breed a race with hooves, that the Catskill children of the future might run through the snows and meadows and marshes as easily as deer. I got to worrying about the deer, and for many days I climbed trees and cut down tender limbs for them. At first only 2 came, then 5, and soon I had a ring of large-eyed white-tailed deer waiting at my tree at twilight for me to come out and chop off limbs. I was astonished to see this herd grow, and wondered what signals they used to inform each other of my services. Did they smell fatter? Look more contented? Somehow, they were able to tell their friends that there was a free lunch on my side of the mountain, and more arrived. One evening, there were so many deer, I had decided to chop limbs on the other side of the meadow. They were cutting up the snow and tearing up the ground around my tree with their pawing. 3 nights later, they all disappeared. Not one deer came for limbs. I looked down the valley and in the dim light could see the open earth on the land below. The deer could forage again. Spring was coming to the land. My heart beat faster. I think I was trembling. The valley also blurred. The only thing that can do that is tears. So I guess I was crying. That night the great horned owls boomed out across the land. My notes read, February 10. I think the great horned owls have eggs. The mountain is white, the wind blows, the snow is hard-packed, but spring is beginning in their hollow maple. I will climb it tomorrow. February 12. Yes, 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 yes. It is spring in the maple. 2 great horned owl eggs lie in the cold snow-rimmed cavity in the broken top of the tree. They were warm to my touch. Eggs in the snow. Now isn't that wonderful? I didn't stay long, for it is bitter weather and I wanted the female to return immediately. I climbed down, and as I ran off toward my tree, I saw her drift on those muffled wings of the owl through the limbs and branches as she went back to her work. I crawled through the tunnel of my ice that leads to my tree now, the wind beating at my back. I spent the evening whittling and thinking about the owl high in the forest with the first new life of the spring. And so, with the disappearance of the deer, the hoot of the owl, the cold land began to create new life. Spring is terribly exciting when you are living right in it. I was hungry for green vegetables, and that night as I went off to sleep, I thought of the pokeweeds, the dandelions, the spring beauties that would soon be pressing up from the earth.